This one's going to be a little complicated, folks. As with the original version of this case, done in episode 3, I have to admit up front that I'm going to be talking today about a work of classical literature that I just don't like, and I receive my share of grief about it. Allow me to explain myself, as well as right some wrongs that I committed the first time I talked about this book. Today, let's revisit Mary Shelley's seminal and immortal work, Frankenstein. Welcome to A Case for Classics, the podcast where I try to talk you into reading, for fun, those works of literature that maybe you've come to associate with homework and book reports. They might exist on a master curriculum list somewhere, but that doesn't mean they aren't valuable as entertainment to the modern sensibility. This episode will be a humbling experience for me, but it's one that comes from growth and will hopefully encourage even more growth from my hopelessly flawed self. Unlike with the previous 2 recasts that I've done of earlier episodes, I won't be doing a rereading of that original script. That original script contains some, not exactly inaccuracies, but mistakes. Things that weren't explained as thoroughly as they ought to have been. So I'm doing a bit of rewriting here in order to correct myself and the record. I've also got to better explain my dislike for this book, which is ludicrous, I know. It's a classic of my beloved horror genre, and it's written by a woman. It hit my 2 biggest happy buttons. But I have to admit that I've been a little hard on Mary Shelley in the past, expecting more out of my predecessor as a female creator than maybe I ought to have, and I think I've been unfair. And I admit that freely. It doesn't change things, and I'll make sure to clearly lay out for you what about this book doesn't work for me, but I'll also make sure to be fair to my sister in spookiness this time around. She deserves better, and she sure as heck deserves the respect of this podcast and this horror writer. I'm appropriately humbled this time, and my high horse has been stabled. So, in the beginning of episode 3, I talked a lot about Tumblr by way of Pinterest. Let me explain. I don't have Tumblr, and as a former GeoCities acolyte, I don't think I'll ever have one. Once upon a time, one social media site was enough, and I'm just too darned old. But I do have Pinterest, and unlike some very unfair dismissive assumptions will tell you, there's a wealth of information on Pinterest that has nothing to do with macrame and hot dog art, although they are well represented. Pinterest also has popular Tumblr posts that get pinned by other users, and some of those posts aim to be informative while also interesting. And you know what that means, don't you? Free trivia for me. I love that kind of stuff, and I spend more time than I ought to reading these Tumblr by way of Pinterest posts, learning new things and laughing at the wit of the people posting. Where Mary Shelley is concerned, well, it's sweet, actually. There's a large group of Mary Shelley fans out there, and they love spreading word about her and her place as a founder of certain genres, and her place as one of the first goths in Western culture. Frankly, she deserves this, and it's a shame that she's not around to see it. I've seen too many articles in recent years lauding H.G. Wells and Jules Verne as the creators of the sci-fi genre, and, well, you were here last week, so you know that's not true, but it's egregious because people continue to overlook or outright erase Shelley and her contributions to the modern sci-fi and horror genres. So let's rehash some things. Mary Shelley released Frankenstein in 1818. Jules Verne didn't start getting published until 1851. And H.G. Wells's The Time Machine came out in 1895. Shelley easily has them beat by a few decades. But beyond that, in episode 3, I asserted that, unlike what some of these enthusiastic Tumblr posts say, Mary Shelley was not the first sci-fi writer. Technically, that distinction tends to go to Johann Kepler, whose fantasy work Somnium, which was written in 1608 but was released posthumously in 1634. It deals with the science of astronomy and space travel. Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift usually comes next in the line of succession for oldest sci-fi story, published in 1728. It's a little more delicate in its use of science as a plot-driving device, but it's there. Frankenstein is third on this list, and it's a work that uses science much more blatantly than Gulliver's Travels. If you can be more sci-fi or less sci-fi, Frankenstein beats Gulliver's Travels, I think. Sure, the sci-fi genre picked up steam and got more readership with Verne and Wells, but they weren't the first, and making sure that an 18-year-old girl's contribution is not forgotten is a very worthy cause if you ask me. So maybe she's not the first. Mary Shelley didn't invent the sci-fi genre, but she's an important co-founder, a pillar on which other works must stand, and that can't be left out of the conversation. The horror genre tends to keep her name alive and well more often, so I don't need to yell at them. Unless I do. Having read Frankenstein 4 times now, I can say that it is a horror book with hints of sci-fi to it, but it is mostly horror. An 18-year-old girl rocked the genre with one of our greatest classical monsters decades before Bram Stoker gave us Dracula in 1897. She's important to both genres because of that seminal work, and don't you forget it. Now, as for the goth thing, I don't know. I love goths, and if I didn't have such a fussy conservative mother, I would have been one as a teenager. But it wasn't worth the fights, and I'm left loving them from afar. Was Mary Shelley a goth? If she was, she didn't know it, but she sure as heck did gothy things. She was named after her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, who died shortly after Shelley was born. But her mother was buried close by her childhood home, and she used to visit her mother's grave as a child and trace her fingers along the engraved headstone. That's how she learned to write her name. She also, most likely, lost her virginity either on top of or within sight of her mother's grave, in a graveyard either way. Very goth. When her husband, Percy Shelley, died, she kept his heart wrapped in a silk cloth in her desk drawer. Super goth. So, yeah, I have no problem with that assertion. It's fun. Every time I talk about Mary Shelley, I make sure to tell people to read this amazing biography about her titled simply Mary Shelley by Miranda Seymour. Hers was an interesting and hard life. I came out of that reading with a very low opinion of Percy Shelley and a better understanding of Mary Shelley. It's a long book, but worth it. So worth it. I'll post in the show notes a basic link to the book, but I got to read it from my local library, so check yours out and see if they have it. I'm going to forego talking about Mary Shelley's life further because the temptation to overshare certain details is too much, so I'll just leave you with the recommendation to read that biography. And the tidbit that, as a widow, she later fell madly in love with and hoped to marry American writer Washington Irving of Sleepy Hollow fame. That would have been interesting. Now about the book. I mentioned earlier that I've now read the book 4 times. The last time was very recently when we talked about the book and the 1994 movie on the Ghostwriters podcast. That was a 3-hour-long episode, and I'll link it in the show notes. But my last reading of the book, alongside that very flawed movie, led me to some clarity about really why I don't like the book. In reading about Mary Shelley's life, you'll learn that she was always struggling to support herself and her only surviving child, Percy Florence Shelley. Excuse me. When she had some free time, she spent a lot of it collaborating with her late husband's friends to make sure that his works were polished and published and republished, a way to make sure that even though he had died, his works would not. In hindsight, I think that's a shame because I think if Mary Shelley had had more time to devote to writing, not for whoever would pay her, but for her heart, she may have revisited Frankenstein and seen that there was something in the story that needed more attention, that being the monster. If you've never read Frankenstein and only seen the movies, you might get what I'm talking about. We are more enthralled with the monster, with his sad state of being and his struggles to come to terms with what he is, something he never asked for, and something he ultimately didn't want to be. There's a tragic beauty to the monster, And there are many of us who relate to that, who feel that pain and share it. It's a great character and a great point of view to explore, and the movies really seize on that. Most film adaptations really take the time to showcase the pain of the monster, the unbearable loneliness and self-loathing. But, sorry, that's all such a small part of the book. The book is titled Frankenstein because it is about the creator, not the creation. And I think, had Mary Shelley been afforded the time to revisit her work, maybe she would have seen that and given us more time with the creature. I don't like Victor Frankenstein. He's a pompous coward who takes way too long to accept responsibility for his egotistical venture and the pained creature they brought about. Every time the book loses me when, after countless hours of research and work, he's successful at what he set out to do. He reanimated a dead human being. And as soon as that previously dead hand twitches, what does he do? He runs away, locks himself in his bedroom, and goes to sleep. There are countless writing classes that, if the story were submitted with that scene, the instructor would demand to know why this ambitious, driven individual ran away from that which he was feverishly moving towards. To be fair, maybe he didn't think it would work, that he couldn't do it, and when it did work, he flinched, and a nap was what he needed to regroup. But it's a scene that pulls me out of the story every time. I want more of the monster because that's what makes this story great. And that's what makes this story endure for centuries. That journey of starting out as scared and kind and wanting to be helpful and accepted, to the downward spiral of rejection, fear, pain, and abject isolation, and ultimately to the rage he felt towards his maker. It's all told so quickly in the book, and the film adaptations always make sure to show the monster's descent into anger and self-hatred, and less about the doctor because the doctor's journey isn't the interesting one. It's not the emotionally packed one. It could have been, but in the book, Frankenstein is such an unlikable character that you end up feeling nothing when he ultimately dies at the end. That's a spoiler, and I'm sorry if I ruined that for you if you haven't read it, but I need to really make sure you understand that the reader's emotional attachment not being with the main character makes the read seem tedious and devoid of feeling. Now, you all know I am no literary critic. I just told you that I was going to make doubly sure that I detail what I don't like about this important classic. I'm not happy that I don't like this book. My life and standing as a female horror creator and fan are greatly compromised by my dislike of this book. There are things about Frankenstein that are great, and I'm glad they transcend time. But there are problems too, and I think maybe 4 times is enough for me. I've read it enough, and I've yet to be talked out of my opinion. Having said that, this book is important. It's foundational in both the sci-fi and horror genres. Mary Shelley's name is immortal because of this book, and that's saying something that my little opinion of the book cannot. There's something there that continues to resonate with readers. It's the monster, I already told you. But that point of view says so much with so relatively few words. If you have ever doubted Mary Shelley's talent as a writer, then I have to assume you've never read Frankenstein. If you buy into the conspiracy theory that she didn't actually write it, that her husband or maybe even Lord Byron wrote it, all I can say is fix your head. An 18-year-old girl put to paper one of the most devastating examples of existential dread that still hits home today. We can't take that away from her, nor should we want to. Mary Shelley was, and is, kind of a huge deal. Respect it. Up until now, this has all been new material. I've scrapped a lot of the original script of episode 3 because I didn't do a very good job of making my opinions clear. It's a tricky place to be in, to try to talk you into reading a book that I admit I don't like, but I really do think it's required reading for some people. All writers, regardless of genre, should read Frankenstein. There's a lot to learn in there. I also think all horror fans should read Frankenstein. Look hard and figure out why this is a horror book aside from the obvious murders and monster. It's subtle, but the main dose of horror in this book is not the in-your-face stuff. It's the desperation the monster feels, watching the family of immigrants and wanting so much to be part of their family, only to be hit and chased away when they see him. It's the little children screaming in fear when they see the creature, and Victor himself recoiling from the creature he made, the creature who looks on him as all he knows. Sadness, bone-deep sadness, has horror to it. Now I'm going to insert the last bits of the original script where I talk about some screen adaptations and the end. Remember to check out the show notes over to caseforclassics.com, and please check out the biography by Miranda Seymour. Now it's time to get to the part of my case that usually makes me cranky, but today will not. Let's talk about movie adaptations. First, let me explain why I'm a little more easygoing on the adaptations of this book than my usual. There are things about the science needed to resurrect a dead body that Mary Shelley glosses over in the book. They're things that she herself obviously didn't understand, so she more or less hints at things being done. I can't blame her there. Heck, I do it in my own writing. As long as you get the basic idea, and I don't have to show how little I know on the subject, we can get back to the story. But here's the thing. In the movies, the science aspect is always one of the most exciting parts. The decked out lab, the character of a lab assistant, the lightning storm. It's all very cinematic and riveting, and it's always been kind of a letdown to me that the book features none of that. The Universal Studios release, starring Boris Karloff, came out in 1931. They dumbed down the creature, and that's kind of sad, but they do put little hints in about the sadness of existence that the creature feels. Also, I love that those old movies didn't have constant music in the background. There's a lot of silence and soft atmospheric noise, and it somehow adds more tension than loud building music that you just know is preparing you for an annoying jump scare. Actually, in the sequel to this, Bride of Frankenstein, released in 1935, there's more of the monster's despair, with that incredible line from Karloff, "We belong dead." Hammer Studios put out several Frankenstein movies, and they get the idea right by making the Mad Doctor the real villain. You can't get any better than Peter Cushing as the unhinged, determined doctor. Cushing has yet to be surpassed, or even equaled, as Van Helsing, but his turn as Dr. Frankenstein is malignant beauty. In 1994, Kenneth Branagh tried his hand at the Frankenstein story. It's very 90s. Look, I think it's a really good try, and they actually get a lot of stuff right. They really used the book to make the screenplay, instead of just taking the names and putting them into an entirely different story. Robert De Niro does a great job as the sharp-featured man, as he's known in the credits. He's the creature. And Kenneth Branagh is always great. Helena Bonham Carter, as a fresh-faced actress, has a bad turn in this, and there's even a surprise, serious role for John Cleese. If you want to know the absolute best representation of the creature so far, I can tell you where to find it. Showtime had a show called Penny Dreadful, and I liked it, but the absolute best part of the entire show was Rory Kinnear's portrayal of the creature. They got it right, and I have to imagine that Mary Shelley would have cried tears of happiness over how heartbreaking that character is. He's sweet, sensitive, all alone in the world, and guilt-ridden by his outbursts of murderous rage when the world treats him badly for the way he looks, for the way he was made. There are a few instances of him being treated like an equal, like he belongs, and his response of surprise and gratitude are agonizing to watch. It's beautiful. All right, get your hands on that biography, link in the show notes, and get yourself a head full of knowledge about Mary Shelley and the legend of the book Frankenstein. Then get a copy of Frankenstein and read it. The idea is wonderful. The beginning and end scenes taking place on a plain of ice and desolation are emblematic of life for both Frankenstein and the creature. The characters are great, even if they do completely bafflingly stupid things that ruin the whole dang book for me. Give it a try and tell me, like everyone else, why I'm wrong. And that's the case for this week. I hope I inspired you to pick up a new book. If you'd like to hear more from me, I co-host a horror-related podcast called The Ghostwriters Podcast with authors Mary Sangiovanni and Matt Wilderson. Find me on social media. The show has a Facebook page and a Twitter account. Just search for A Case for Classics. Do you have something nice to say? Get in touch. acaseforclassics.com is the best place for that. I have no options for you if you have mean things to say, just please don't. If you enjoyed this show, please consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or any other streaming service you use. It would really help the show, and we could talk books to a bigger audience. A Case for Classics is written, narrated, and edited by me, Summer Cannon. Thanks for listening, and I hope you tune in for another case next week.